So we're going to look at administration now, and this covers your responsibilities as a supervisor. But the first thing you need to be aware of is, how do you enrol as a supervisor? So you might say, well, as a supervisor, how do I know if my trainee's enrolled? Well, you'll know because the first thing is that you have to sign the form as well. Okay? And the other thing is that they have to send a cheque with it. And lots of you will be stumping up the money for the cheque. Okay? You may not, but equally. So there's a part of the enrolment form that you complete as a supervisor and part that the trainee completes. And what's included in that enrolment form is the supervisor undertaking. And essentially, that's a posh way of saying the things that you promised that you're going to provide for your trainee during their pre-registration training. Okay? And so the form needs to be completed. It would be great if we had that form a week or two before they were due to start with you. Now, the actual fees for the scheme are paid in 2 instalments. The first instalment you have to pay, and it's about 1/3 of the cost, you have to pay when the enrolment form comes in, and the remainder has to be paid by the end of December in the current year. And what that covers is up to 4 stage 1 assessments. John's referred to those already. The first stage 2 assessment, their first attempt at stage 2, and their first attempt at the final assessment. Now, as supervisors working within community practice, you are eligible to claim a training grant from your PCT in 2 instalments. And if you're in Scotland, it's from your health board. Okay, you can claim the first instalment after the trainee's been with you 6 months, and then at the end of 12 months. And the key thing with this is that it applies for trainees in their first period of training. Now, there are every year a handful, and it is a handful of trainees who don't complete the scheme in the specified time period. And if it is because they're not competent, well, then that's the end really for them. But if it's because something exceptional has happened to them during their training, then it's fair that the Education Committee considers that circumstance and makes a judgment about whether they will allow the trainee to undertake training one further time. One of the reasons why we need the enrolment form in early is because we have to check out a number of things. The first thing we need to check is, has the trainee a 2-2 classification degree? And have they got something else called a certificate of clinical competence? Now, this isn't a piece of paper, right? It just basically says that during their time that they were at university, they passed assessments in various practical skills, which means that they are then fit to be let loose on the public under your supervision. Okay? So that's what we check for the trainee. But then there are things that we check for you as well as a supervisor. And the first one is the fact that you actually have been registered long enough to be a supervisor, that you've got enough time to actually supervise this trainee, in that you haven't got an army of other trainees that you're looking after. And we check that you're a member of the college. And to be a supervisor on your own, okay, you need to be registered with the GOC for at least 3 years, all right, post-qualification. We have got another arrangement in place now for a group of people called secondary supervisors. And the reason we introduced this was because we had a number of supervisors saying to us, actually, in my practice, I've got an optometrist who's been qualified a couple of years. They're much closer to having gone through this scheme than I am, and they help the trainee quite a lot. So why can't we have some kind of an arrangement where the 2 of us in partnership look after the trainee? And so that's where we introduce this whole kind of person into the scheme called a second supervisor, and we'll have a look at that as we go through. So if you're an only supervisor in practice, you have to be qualified at least 3 years, all right? This is the kind of normal arrangement that's out there. You may be a supervisor who's in practice with other experienced optometrists in a big practice, and you take on a lot of trainees every year. Okay? Now, as long as the trainees don't number more than the supervisors, then that's okay. And then we've got this other arrangement where we've got a principal supervisor working in partnership with a secondary supervisor, where the secondary supervisor is a more recently qualified individual. So as I said, they're closer to the kind of coalface in terms of, you know, what happens in going through this assessment. They might have a bit more empathy with the trainee than you have. But equally, they don't have the breadth of experience that you've got. And so in this arrangement, the principal supervisor has to be responsible for the trainee for at least 50% of the time. Okay? So in other words, in this arrangement, you could have this guy and two of these looking after a couple of trainees. All right? You don't end up with one principal and an army of secondaries looking after an army of trainees. All right? And you certainly don't have a situation where we would register a secondary supervisor to look after a trainee on their own. Now, what's interesting with this situation is that on the days when this person, the secondary supervisor, is looking after the trainee, they are totally responsible for the trainee on those days. The whole point of this person is that they kind of oversee the training. All right? So they're the ones who look at where the trainee can get the range of experience that they need. They're the one that will liaise with the hospital usually to sort out the hospital placement. But they kind of have the overall kind of responsibility for the training period. All right? Although on a day-to-day basis, these guys have equal responsibility for supervising the trainee and looking after the patients that they see. And so there are some other acceptable supervision arrangements which are kind of outside of the norm really, and one of those is within the hospital. Now what happens in a hospital is the fact that we would normally register one optometrist as the supervisor for any trainees who are in that hospital. And then together with other GOC or GMC registrants, they take responsibility for what the trainee is doing on a day-to-day basis. And the other place is essentially where trainees are at different stages in the scheme. So here we've got one supervisor who's been registered three years or more, looking after two trainees. But these two trainees will be at totally different stages in the scheme. So for example, if this trainee has actually got to stage 2 and they've had to resit, and so they've failed to sit the July OSCE and they're going to be sitting in September, well then you might have a new trainee lined up to start middle of July. Well, that can happen, provided you can provide appropriate experience for both, so that the experience of one doesn't impact on the experience of the other. So, temporary supervision, what happens when you go on holiday? Okay, well, you can arrange a temporary supervisor, and temporary supervision can be carried out by anybody who is a registered optometrist. They don't have to be members of the college. As long as they are on the GOC register, they can temporarily supervise your trainee. That can happen provided the time period that the temporary supervisor is looking after the trainee doesn't amount to more than 30 days, 6 weeks during each year, or a continuous period of more than 4 weeks, 20 days. We've had trainees saying, ooh, 6 weeks, that means 42 days. No, it doesn't. It means 30 days. Okay? If it goes on for longer than those two sort of specified periods of time, then the other supervisor then has to enrol and become a registered supervisor. So what do you promise as a supervisor in the supervisor undertaking? Well, it forms part of the enrolment form, and there are some key areas that I just want to cover now, all right? But obviously you need to read it thoroughly before you sign your enrolment form. It actually requires the supervisor to provide continuous personal supervision to the trainee. Now what that means is that the supervisor needs to be on the premises when the trainee is testing site. And essentially it means under the same roof. And we'll have a look at that in a moment. And the other thing that was changed in terms of this continuous supervision was that in 2010 we insisted that trainees noted in their logbook and on the record card the name of the person who was supervising them at the time when they saw that patient. Okay. And the reason is that the supervisor is always accountable for the actions of the trainee. And so if there is deficient sort of professional conduct, it's both the supervisor and the trainee who are investigated by the GOC. So what did we mean by this in a position to intervene? Well, essentially it depends on what the trainee's doing, okay? So if they're doing something which is risky, so say the first time they've actually carried out contact tonometry while working in your practice, then it would be a very good idea if you were actually in the room at their elbow, okay? Because really what you're trying to avoid is risk to the patient. And from that point on, you decide how close you're going to be, all right? But the patient should never leave the premises without you being in a position to intervene, okay? And so you do need to be in the same building, under the same roof, okay? If your trainee's upstairs and you're downstairs, well then how long the length of distances will be determined by what they're doing, okay? And sometimes it is helpful if you can delegate the supervision of your trainee to someone else who's got a specialism in a particular area. Because, you know, I know you guys are all expert in every area of optometry, but I certainly am not. And when I was a supervisor, I certainly was not. And there were people out there who were a lot better at some things than I was. And I wanted to get the best experience for my trainee. And so it makes sense that, you know, in your practice, if you've got a contact lens optician who is really hot on RGP lens fitting, and you're not, then that you should be able to sort of delegate supervision for your trainee on occasion to that other person, okay? And that's fine, as long as they're a GOC or a GMC registrand. And so within the scheme, there is provision for that to happen. But your responsibility as a supervisor is to ensure that you make the arrangements for delegation clear to all the parties who are involved, both the trainee, the temporary supervisor, because you still remain accountable for the trainee's actions. And if you're not sure about any of this, give us a ring and we'll look at the situation that you're talking about and we'll say, yeah, either that's fine or what you need to do. All right? So as a supervisor, you are accountable for ensuring that everybody involved in this knows what their role is. So the accountable person is the registered supervisor. Okay? And so what else do you say you're going to do? Well, you say you're going to provide for the trainee consulting room access, and it says in the guidance for the testing of site for at least 20 hours a week. So if you've got more than one trainee, you know, the one who is resitting the OSCE, for example, and the new trainee, you've got to be providing the appropriate consulting room access for both of them. There is a contract on the AOP website you can look at. The other side of this as well is the fact that because they're your employee, you have to pay them the minimum wage. It's illegal to employ somebody without paying them the minimum wage. And the other, at least, yeah, yes. Well, we do get trainees who kind of say, I'm prepared to do this on a voluntary basis. No, this is about employment, and you can't do employment on a voluntary basis. Okay, and the other side of it is hospital experience. Now, it's compulsory for trainees to have hospital experience, and we expect they have to complete at least a week. We expect that normally they would do between a week and 3 weeks full-time equivalents over the course of the pre-registration period. And I think the thing to bear in mind is the hospital experience isn't solely about them going to hospital to see those patients that you will have difficulty providing experience with in your practice. It's about the whole thing of following the patients through. Right? It's about seeing what happens in the hospital. Okay? Because that helps to make them better optometrists in practice, because they can advise patients more effectively. Now, some hospitals, in terms of the hospital experience, have become incredibly expert at providing tailored experience for trainees in the scheme for registration. And they will provide tutorials for them, specific clinics tailored to what their needs are. But essentially, the thing you need to bear in mind is that hospitals are businesses, as community practices are. And so they're going to charge you a fee. And you should expect it to be at least 20% of the training grant. And some hospitals will charge more than that. If you're struggling, the key thing with hospital experience is to organise it early. Okay? One of the things the assessors will do when they come to do that visit 1 is that they'll say to the trainee, is your hospital experience arranged? And then they'll say at visit 2, is your hospital experience arranged? And they'll say at visit 3, is that hospital experience arranged? And they'll be following it up with you as a supervisor. Don't underestimate how difficult it can be to gain hospital experience in your location of choice, because you can be sure it's everybody else's location of choice too, and particularly if you're in London. Now, there are plenty of hospital places for trainees, and if you're struggling to find experience for your trainee, speak to your assessor in the first instance, and if they can't help you, then contact the college, because across the UK we've got a number of hospital optometrists who are happy to arrange tailored experience for trainees on a block placement. Okay, so speak to us if you're struggling. What else you do? Well, you say you'll promise to provide experience for your trainee to complete 350 refractions. It's actually eye examinations. In the handbook, there's an explanation of what we mean by this, and 250 dispensings. And some of you may say, oh gosh, that's easier than when I did it. You know, we had to do 350. We had to do 500 refractions and 350 dispensings, but you didn't have to provide evidence to show that you'd seen specific patient types. So it's not just the breadth of your experience, it's also a specific range of experience as well. And you promise that you're going to provide your trainee with the breadth of experience that they need to be able to pass through the scheme. And, you know, for some of us, that will involve outsourcing that experience, as it were, with those temporary supervision arrangements. In terms of assessment visits, well, ensuring there's appropriate room available and that you're available for the feedback and action planning at the end of the assessment visit. And all the information that we give you today and we have given to trainees is in the trainee handbook and the supervisor handbook, and they're online. The up-to-date versions of those are actually on the college website now. So when you enrol your trainee, you'll receive your own copy of both. Talked about relationship. Sometimes the relationship breaks down. Sometimes trainees need to move to the other end of the country for personal reasons, whatever. But essentially, when that happens and that supervision period is coming to an end, you have a responsibility as the supervisor to complete an end of supervision form. If you don't complete that form, whether the trainee is with you or not, you're still responsible for them. So